Welcome back to Mode Bespoke, I'm Atenas. For today's tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make a Tunisian crochet raglan. This project is going to be worked in the round, and it is for intermediate to advanced crocheters. So let's get started. PDF pattern for this project is available in my shop, so you can go to modebespoke.com or click on the link below to purchase the pattern. Here's a look at the sweater we're going to be crocheting today. Now this is going to be a measurement based pattern, so I'm not going to be giving you any stitch counts for any particular size. I will give you the different measurements so that you can crochet this in any size you want, whether it's for babies or if you want to make this for an adult. You'll be able to crochet this in any size you want. You're also going to be able to crochet this using any yarn weight, any yarn size, whatever you call it, and any yarn and hook combination that you have available to you. So you are going to need a double-ended crochet hook because we are going to be crocheting in the round. If you don't have a double-sided hook, you can still crochet a sweater kind of similar to this, only it's open in the front. I'll leave the link down in the description box below. It's called Kai's sweater, and it is a two-part tutorial, so I'll link that down in the description box below. In order to crochet this pattern, you will need to be comfortable using two different techniques, and the first one is crocheting a knit stitch, because as you can see, this is the primary stitch for this pattern. You will also need to know how to crochet an extended return pass so that you will have a stretchy fabric. If you don't know how to work with either of those, I do have different tutorials you can watch. There's the Beginner Tunisian 101 class, in which I teach you how to crochet 5 different stitches, one of them being the knit stitch, and the other one, the extended return pass, and that's in a tutorial called Tunisian Stretchy Fabric or something like that. It's going to be down in the description box. Check out those links below. To figure out your yarn and hook combination, you're going to need to make a small swatch. Now, for the small swatch, you're going to need to use the knit stitch and the extended return pass. So you'll have to be very comfortable working with those two. So make a small swatch and then take a look at your fabric. Now, if your fabric has a lot of spacing, so there's a lot of spacing between your knit stitches and it looks a little like this, now you know that you have to switch to a smaller hook. If you want, or if I guess your stitches are too tightly knit together, then you're going to need a larger hook, but try different hook combinations, try different yarn combinations. And once your swatch looks the way you want your fabric, or the fabric of your sweater to look, then you know you've arrived at the right hook and yarn combination. And there you go. So in just a moment, I'm going to give you the sizing chart. And now the sizing chart includes just standard measurements going from newborn to adult. And this is for men and women. So check that out here in just a moment. For those of you interested in the printable PDF copy, you can find that in my shop. There's going to be a link in the description box. So let's talk a little about the construction of this sweater. We are going to begin at the neckline, so it's a top-down sweater. We're going to begin at the elastic, then we're going to create the yoke, which is going to be this raglan look right here. Once you have the yoke, we're going to begin the body of the sweater, then you're going to do the hemline, and at the end, we're going to work on the sleeves. So the first measurement you're going to need is going to be the head circumference for whatever age group you're going to crochet this sweater for. So it's also going to give you the number of stitches you need for the top part of your raglan or your yoke. You can find these measurements on my hat sizing chart. Now for the hat sizing chart, you have the different age groups, then the crown width, the height, the circumference. The only measurement you need from this chart is the circumference for the age group that you're crocheting the sweater for. Alternatively, you can just take a measuring tape and measure around the person's head. Alright, so let's begin with the actual crochet part of this. And I know it's like 7 minutes into the video or so before we actually start the crocheting, but we had a lot of notes to cover and we have to set up the foundation for our sweater correctly so that, you know, it doesn't ruin our project. So keep that in mind, and now at least you know where to skip to. Let's make a slip knot. Now, if you don't know how to make a slip knot, then this tutorial is too advanced for you, my friend. Make your slip knot. Make a chain. That chain needs to measure the head circumference for whatever size you are crocheting. In my case, it is a 19-inch circumference, so my chain is going to measure 19 inches. Count your stitches as you chain. You're going to need that number for some math. Once you've made the chain whatever length that you need, make sure you write the number of stitches. And now let's go math. Alright, so for 19 inches, I crocheted a total of 80 chains. Now you're going to divide those 80 chains by 5. Why are we dividing by 5? Because you need 2 pieces for the arm, 2 pieces for the front, 1 piece for the back of the sweater. Now I know that this isn't an open sweater, so technically you don't need 2 pieces for the front, but if you use the same method every time to create your yoke, you're gonna get a yoke that fits every time. So humor me, 2, 2, 1 for a total of 5. Alright, so moving on. So we did the 80 divided by 5, which gave us 16. Now you're gonna take those 80 and divide it by 2. That's gonna give you 40. Why 2? Because you're doing the sleeves kind of a separate thing. I know it might not make sense. I've explained this in another tutorial, but let's speed this up. 80 divided by 2 is 40. You're going to do the 40 minus the 16. And now we have all the numbers we need. We're going to be looking at that 16 and that 24. So the shoulder measurement is going to require 16 chains. The front and back of the sweater are each going to require 24. That means 16 plus 16, so one shoulder plus another shoulder plus the front plus the back of the sweater gives us a total of 80 stitches. Now, while I did have 80 stitches for that 19-inch chain, it doesn't always necessarily work out that way, so you are going to have to do the math. No, it is not the same 80 chains. Sometimes you might have more, sometimes you might have less. So do the math. The important part is to get those shoulder numbers, the front and back numbers, so that you can create your yoke. Now, do not use fractions. So if you got a shoulder measurement of like 16.5 stitches, do not use 16.5. So no decimals, no fractions, nothing like that. You need to use a whole number. So decide whether you're going to use 16 stitches or 17 stitches. So let's move on. I'm not going to need this long chain anymore since we're going to begin on the neckline now. The neckline can be as wide as you want. So this elastic band right along the top can be anywhere between about 1 inch to at least 2 inches. I use that same measurement for the hemline and the cuffs. So whatever measurement you decide to use, just make sure that you jot down the number of initial chains because you're going to use that several times throughout the pattern. Now to begin this, you're again going to start with a slip knot and you're going to begin with a chain. Now the chain can be any number of stitches so long as it gives you the width that you want for the elastic. So I'm going to chain about 7 stitches is normally about-ish what I do. That's going to give me about 1.5 inches approximately. I think that's about 3 centimeters. So that'll be about 1.5 inches in width for that elastic band. Now you're going to have to cast on a foundation row. So for the foundation row, you are always going to skip that first stitch because you already have it on your hook. So you're going to go into that next chain. So the second chain from your hook, insert your hook into the stitch. And then you're going to yarn over and you're going to cast on 1 loop. So we've got 2 loops on our hook so far. You're going to go through and cast on 1 loop for every one of the stitches of the chain. So you always insert your hook into this stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, leave the loop on your hook. So make sure you count the number of loops that you have at the end of it so that you have that same number throughout the elastic band. Sometimes you might miss a stitch or 2. So make sure you keep count of how many loops you've cast on right here for this foundation row. Now for the return pass, you're going to yarn over and pull through 1. And for the rest of the stitches, so all the rest of these loops, you're going to yarn over and pull through 2. So yarn over, pull through 1, 2, yarn over, pull through 1, 2, and this is just a regular return pass. You're going to complete this until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. Now, the stretchy part, or this elastic part, is made up of 2 rows. So it's a 2-row repeat, and you're going to be using the space between the stitching. So if you want to call it the chain space or whatever you want to call it, it is the space between your vertical stitches. So if I pull this right here, it's going to be the spacing right in here. So not the vertical stitch, the space between it. So for the first row, you're going to insert your hook into that chain space between the first and second vertical stitch, through the back of the fabric, yarn over, and cast on 1. So again, behind the fabric, you're going to insert your hook between the vertical stitches, so in the chain space, you're going to yarn over and cast on a stitch. So I'll keep showing you here for the remaining stitches of the row, but you're going to cast on 1 until you get to the second to last stitch. So you're going to leave this very last chain space right here. You're going to skip this. So this is on row 1, but you are going to cast on into the final stitch of the row. So skip this and work into the final stitch, which is right here. So I'll go through and cast on in that final stitch of the row. So if you're looking at the written pattern, this right here is the final stitch of the row. Once you've cast on, you're going to work your regular return pass. Remember to count your loops, make sure it's the same number that you had in the previous row. I cannot speak today. But then complete your regular return pass. So a quick review on that regular return pass, we are going to yarn over and pull through 1 loop. And for the rest of the row, it's yarn over, pull through 2 until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. So then we begin row 2. Now row 2, we're going to work from the front of the fabric towards the back. You are still working in that chain space. So skip the first chain space. So between the first and second vertical stitch, skip that chain space, go into the next one, and that is between the second and third vertical stitch. Insert your hook from the front of the fabric. So this time we're working front to back, and you're just going to cast on. So insert your hook into the chain space. Then you're going to yarn over and pull up a loop, leave the loop on your hook, and repeat with all of the chain spaces of the row. Now for that row 2, since you skipped that first chain space, you're going to work into the final chain space of the row. So you're just going to alternate. So you're either going to skip the first chain space or you're going to skip the last one. So we skipped the last one on row 1 and we skipped the first one on row 2. So here we are at the end of the row. Here's my final chain space. You're going to cast on in that final chain space, and then you are also going to cast on in the final stitch of the row, which is again the little side stitch right over here, and it's going to be the bottommost chain. Once you have cast on, you're going to work a regular return pass. So just yarn over, pull through 1, then yarn over, pull through 2 until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. Remember to count your loops to make sure that you have the same number throughout the rest of the elastic. Now for the rest of the elastic band, you're going to be working row 1 and row 2 repeats. For the count, so there is going to be a row count. Now row count is going to be the number of chains you calculated. So I'm going to keep working here in the background so that you can see the row 1 and row 2 repeat, but I'm going to talk over it real quick so you get the row count that you're going to need. So that initial chain count that we got, so for me it was that 80, so make sure that you use the one that you added, so the one that was 16, 16, 24, all of that, the one that you added, use that one. I got a total of 80. Now your foundation row and your bind off count, so that does go into your row count. So you're going to need to crochet that, in my case it's going to be 80 minus 2 for that foundation row and that bind off. I need to crochet a total of 78 rows. That will give me the stitch count I need for my yoke. So I'm going to crochet 78 rows of row 1 and row 2 repeat. And then you would work a single crochet bind off, which would be row 79 if we're keeping with this stitch count that I'm working with. So it would be row 79, and then if you add that foundation row that you had already crocheted, that would give me a total of 80, which is the stitch count I need. So let me finish this up real quick. I'm going to show you how to do that bind off, and then we'll move on to the rest of the yoke. Alright, so I've completed the 78 rows and we are ready for that bind off. Now that bind off is going to close the spacing right here along the top, and we're just going to be using a single crochet. Regardless of whether you ended up on a row 1 or a row 2 repeat, you're going to work the bind off the same way, and you're going to insert your hook from the back of the fabric like a row 1 repeat into that first chain space of the row. You're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. Once you have cast on 2 loops on your hook, you're going to close the single crochet by yarning over, and then you're going to pull that top loop through the 2 bottom loops. So yarn over and pull through 2. You're going to be left with just 1 loop on your hook. You're going to repeat this in all of the chain spaces of the row. So again, inserting the hook from the back of the fabric or through the back of the fabric, you're going to insert your hook into the chain space, yarn over, pull up a loop. Once you have 2 loops on your hook, you're going to yarn over and pull through both loops. Now that is the method that I have on the written pattern. Now if you are not using the written pattern and you're just kind of winging it with me in the tutorial, you can also finish this bind off by using the front of the fabric. So instead, you insert your hook from the front, yarn over, and cast on a single crochet. So it's up to you, it doesn't matter, but for those of you that are using the written pattern, I'm using this method that you're seeing on the screen right now. Now, in this final chain space of the row, you are going to have to cast on a single crochet. So let's cast on this stitch, then we're going to close it as a single crochet, and then you're going to single crochet in that final stitch of the row. So we'll grab this last stitch right here, and we single crochet. Alright, so our bind off is ready, and we're ready to begin the yoke. Now we're going to have to cast on a foundation row along the side of the elastic. So I'm going to lay it flat here to show you. You're going to cast on into these side stitches right here. Remember to cast on the same number of initial chains that you calculated. So I'm going to have to cast on 80 loops onto my hook. So just count as you go through. And the stitch you're going to use is right here along the side. So it's right here along the top. I don't know if you can see it very well on the camera, but I'm trying to show it as best as I can. So cast on into these side stitches, just one for every one of the stitches along the row. And then we're going to work the extended return pass once we've cast on all of these stitches in order to make that first row really stretchy. All right, so let's cast on here together. So beginning on this first stitch, we're going to skip into the next stitch, so into the second stitch of the row, and begin casting on there. You already have that first stitch, that first loop is on your hook. Once you have cast on all of your stitches, your work should look like this. Now you begin the extended return pass. For the extended return pass, you're going to yarn over and chain 1, and then you're going to chain a second stitch. So chain 2, and then yarn over, pull through 2. Now for the rest of the row, you're going to chain 1, yarn over, pull through 2, chain 1, yarn over, pull through 2, and then you're going to repeat this throughout the rest of the row. It is going to create some spacing between the stitches. That's what is going to give our Tunisian crochet some stretch. When you have finished completing that return pass, you might notice that your work looks wavy. So here you can see that it's really, really wavy. That is because of that extended return pass. It is totally normal. That extra spacing is going to give the neckline some stretch. So if I pull on this elastic band, you can see that it is really, really stretchy, and that's exactly what we needed for the neckline of this particular pattern. So there's a little trick that you can use for other raglans if you want to. All right, so at this point, it is a good idea to sew your elastic closed. Make sure that it is not twisted before you sew this. I can't speak today. But once it's all sewed, it should look like this. And now we're ready to begin the actual yoke part. So you're going to need to turn your work around so that that final stitch of the row becomes the second vertical stitch of the round. It might sound a little crazy, but it's really not that bad. So all you do is you turn your work around. So here is that final stitch of the row. We're going to cast that on as a knit stitch, and it's going to become the second stitch of our round. So if I insert my hook into the stitch like you would a knit stitch, you're going to yarn over, pull up a loop, and cast that on. So I have 2 loops on my hook. I need 16 stitches for the shoulder, so I need to cast on 16 loops onto my hook. Once I have cast on 15, so we have to do some increases here. So stop 1 stitch before that shoulder count. So I had a shoulder count of 16 stitches. I cast on 15 loops. And now I have to do an increase. So this vertical stitch right here is stitch number 16. So in the chain space right before that stitch, I'm going to insert my hook and I'm going to cast on 1 loop. So insert the hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, and leave that on your hook. Now I'm going to cast on a knit stitch in stitch number 16, or whatever stitch count that was for your measurement. So there's stitch number 16. Grab a stitch marker and place it on that stitch. That way you don't have to count stitches, because I'm a lazy crocheter. I don't know about you. I don't like to count stitches. All right, but we're going to go into the chain space right in here, and that's going to be the chain space between stitch number 16 and 17, and you're going to increase again. So insert your hook into that chain space, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then you're going to cast on the back stitches or front. It's the same count. So I need 24 stitches, which means I need to cast on 23 knit stitches and then do an increase. Do not count the loop that you worked as your increase. So the loop that we cast on between stitch number 16 and 17, that doesn't go into your stitch count. Knit stitch 23 stitches, and then you're going to do an increase right before that last stitch for that shoulder measurement, or the shoulder stitch count, sorry, so for your shoulder stitch count, and then you're going to cast on the next shoulder. So let me cast on 24 knit stitches, and once I've got them all on my hook, so I have 24 loops at this point, because there's the 23 that I cast on plus the 1 loop from the increase. Now I'm going to increase in this next stitch. So between knit stitch number 23 and 24, this would be stitch 24, I'm going to insert my hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop, and that was my increase. Now I'm going to knit stitch into stitch number 24, and then I'm going to place a stitch marker so I don't have to count stitches later. And then we're going to increase again. So between stitch number 24 and stitch number 25, we're going to increase. So insert your hook into the chain space, yarn over, pull up a loop, and you're going to leave that on your hook. Now, you are not going to be able to cast on all of the stitches all the way around because physics. So at some point, you're going to find it difficult to cast on any more stitches, at which point you're going to need to work your return pass, and you're going to use the back of the hook. So you're going to need a second ball, hank, skein, whatever you want to call it. You're going to need your second bit of yarn. Leave a nice long tail end. You can weave that in later. You're going to make a loop, put that on your hook, and now you're going to begin the return pass. You're only going to begin it once. The rest of the return pass is going to be the same throughout. So begin it once and that's it. Remember that we are working in continuous rounds. That's why you only need to start it once. All right, so let's take this top loop and we're going to pass it through the second loop on your hook. And let's drop the tail end of yarn and we're going to chain one. Now, this is what you're going to do for the rest of the return pass. So we need to yarn over and pull through two. And the sequence is chain one, yarn over, pull through two. Chain one, yarn over, pull through two. So it's just the extended return pass. You're going to continue crocheting the return pass until you have about like 4 or 5 loops left on your hook. So don't keep working the return pass until you are left with just the one loop. Leave a few loops here at the end and you'll see why in just a moment. But let me work this return pass and I'll see you again in a minute. All right, so I've left a few loops here at the end of my hook. Now we're going to turn our work around and we have to start casting on again. Now the reason you leave those loops is so that your work doesn't loosen up too much. So it's going to help keep the same tension or an even tension throughout your work. All right, so we're going to cast on into the next vertical stitch and we are working on the second shoulder. For the second shoulder, I had a stitch count of 16. So I'm going to cast on 15 knit stitches. When I get to what would be knit stitch number 16, I'm going to increase using that chain space between stitch number 15 and 16. So I'm going to insert my hook into the stitch, yarn over, and cast on one loop. Now I'm going to cast on a knit stitch in stitch number 16, and I'm going to place a stitch marker on that stitch, and then I have to increase in the stitch right next to it. So in that chain space, we're going to increase again, and then the stitch count that I should have left is the 24 that I need for the front or the back part of my sweater. So I'm going to crochet those remaining 23 stitches. I know it's 24, but we're going to do the 23 because we have that increase. So I'm casting on stitch number 23 right now, and we get to the end of the round. So the first, or what would be stitch number 24, has to be the first vertical stitch of the round. So I'm going to pull on this here, see if you can see it a little bit. But this first stitch of the round becomes stitch number 24. So I'm going to need to do an increase. So I'm going to use this chain space in the row below to cast on that first increase. And then I'm going to pull on my stitching so I can see that first vertical stitch of the round. So it's easier if you pull on this tail end. So it's right there. I don't know if you can see it. Insert your hook into that stitch. That is stitch number 24. Or the final stitch that you need for your shoulder, or the front or back part. Place a stitch marker on it, and then you're going to need to work another increase. So I know I'm off camera here, but I'm trying to get this all set up. All right, so you're going to do your increase in this chain space, and there you go. Your first round is done. Now for the rest of your yoke, you're going to be working those increases on either side of the stitch with the stitch marker. So this is why this stitch marker comes in handy. Now you don't have to count stitches anymore. I told you I am a lazy crocheter, so I only count stitches just to set up my foundation, and once that's all set up, I use my stitch markers as a guide. Now your increases are going to be worked on either side of that stitch marker. So the vertical stitch with the stitch marker, either side, each gets an increase. So for the increase, you just insert your hook into the chain space and pull up a loop. So you're going to work your way around until you get the measurement that you need for your size. So if you don't know what measurement this is, I'm going to crochet a few more rows and then I'll show you what that looks like. But before I do that, I'm going to review that return pass again, and then I'll show you how to do an increase, and then we'll move on. So for that return pass, you just turn your work around so you work with the hook in the back. And like I said, you don't have to start it over again. You're just continuing your return pass. So you're just going to chain one and then yarn over, pull through two, and chain one, yarn over, pull through two, and so forth until again you are left with about maybe 4 or 5 stitches or loops on your hook. Once you're ready to cast on again, just turn your work around, working with the front hook, and cast on the remaining knit stitches until you get to the stitch marker. Once you get to the stitch marker, I'll show you how to do that increase one more time, and then I'll leave you to continue the rest of your yoke. So when you reach your stitch marker, you're going to have to work your increase on the chain space right before it, so right in here. So for that, you're just going to insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop, and leave that loop on your hook. Then you're going to knit stitch into the stitch with the stitch marker, and you're going to move your stitch marker. Truly move the stitch marker. It's going to make your life so much easier, and you won't have to count stitches for a long time. So move the stitch marker, and then you're going to increase by casting on a loop into that chain space right after this vertical stitch. So right in here, insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, and that's it. So your increase is done. Work your way around. Like I said, you're going to have to measure it here in a little bit, but let me add some more length to this and I'll show you where to take the different measurements. So here's a look at the yoke as I've created it so far. Now the measurements that you're going to need to take is the front of the sweater, so make sure that that matches the measurement chart I gave you earlier, or you can also use the sleeve. I double check both just in case, but to get the sleeve measurement, just fold your yoke in half, make sure that the sleeves are along the sides, and just measure right here. So compare those two to the measurement chart, and once you hit those measurements, you can continue working the rest of the pattern. So now we're going to move on to working the body of the sweater. So from here on out, you're no longer going to crochet along the sleeves. So if you've kept your stitch markers in place, this is going to make it a lot easier. Now remember that we were working increases right before and after the stitch marker. Once you start working on the body of the sweater, you no longer use these increases. So you're going to knit stitch right into that vertical stitch with the stitch marker. So we're going to knit stitch right in here. And then you're going to skip the sleeve. So this entire section, which would be the shoulder, you're going to skip all of this and go to the next stitch marker, and you're going to knit stitch in there. Again, you don't need any kind of increase, just knit stitch into the vertical stitch with a stitch marker. So yarn over and pull up a loop. And then you're just going to knit stitch throughout the back part of the sweater. So I'm just going to call this the back part of the sweater. Don't increase anymore. Go right into that next vertical stitch and knit stitch until you get to the next stitch marker. You're going to repeat what I just did in the next pair of stitch markers. So I'm going to knit stitch all the way throughout, and then I'll show you what that looks like again. But here's a peek at the sleeve. So let me just knit stitch all the way to the next stitch marker, and I'll see you again here in just a moment. All right, so we reached the stitch marker. Remember not to increase. So no increase, just knit stitch right into the stitch marker. So that stitch right here. Sorry, I lost this stitch before I fell off my hook, so I had to cast that on again. Once you've cast on into the stitch marker, you're going to skip the shoulder section of the yoke and go into the next stitch marker. Insert your hook into the stitch as a knit stitch, cast on a loop, and there you go. So you're going to knit stitch all the way around. From here on out, you are just going to knit stitch in continuous rounds. There are no more increases, nothing crazy anymore. It's just knit stitch all the way around, over and over and over again, until you get the length that you need for the body of the sweater. Remember that you are still working an extended return pass. So as you work along, remember that the extended return pass is always chain 1 and then yarn over, pull through 2. This will make your sweater nice and stretchy. So I'm going to continue working on here. I'll show you what this looks like here once I've added some length to the sweater. So here's my sweater so far. I've added the length I need. To know when to stop, you're going to measure from just below the armpit all the way to the bottom part of the sweater. So we are still going to add a hemline, so it's going to look just like the elastic band that we did for the neckline. This is also going to be the same method and look we're going to use for the cuff. But again, measure from the armpit to the bottom of the sweater. It's going to add, or at least the elastic I did with the 7 stitches, it's going to add about 1.5 inches to the length of my sweater. Normally I just kind of add it on, so I do the whole length as the measurement, and then that hemline is just extra length, but I'll leave it up to you. All right, to begin with that hemline, you're going to need to work your return pass until you have just 1 loop on your hook. So at this point, you're only going to be working with one side of your hook. So I'll finish up here. That way I'll be left with just the one loop. And if you need to tighten up the stitches, just pull on this thread right below. And now we're going to make a chain that is the same length as the chain that we worked for the neckline. So I made a chain of 7, so I'm going to now chain 7. This way my neckline and the hemline both match in width. Once you get that chain ready, you're going to work on that foundation row. So you're going to skip the first stitch the first stitch from your hook. You're going to go into the second one, and you're just going to cast on 1 stitch for every stitch of the chain. Once you get to the end of the row, you're going to insert your hook into the vertical stitches. So make sure you're looking at the outside of the sweater, not the inside. So the inside looks like this, and the outside has all of the knit stitches. So making sure you're looking at that knit stitch, you're going to insert your hook as a knit stitch into the next vertical stitch following the space where the last stitch where you stopped. So here's that next vertical stitch. So I stopped right here. I'm going to go into the next vertical stitch and cast on a knit stitch. And there we go. Make sure that, again, you count your loops so that you have the same number of loops throughout this whole process. So for the return pass, you're going to yarn over and pull through 2. And then yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, until you are left with just the 1 loop on your hook. And there you go. Now you're going to do that row 1 and row 2 repeat that you did for the neckline so that it looks just like this section right here. So for that row 1 repeat, you're going to insert your hook from the back side of the fabric. So we're going to use the chain spaces between the vertical stitches. We're going to insert our hook between the chain space in the chain space that is between the first and second vertical stitch, yarn over and cast on 1, and then you're going to repeat until you get to the end of the row. Just like you did for that first elastic band that we made, you're going to skip that final stitch. So I'm going to skip this chain space right here. So I'm going to cast on the remaining 2 stitches. So here's this one and this one, and we're going to skip this last chain space, which is this one right here. You're going to knit stitch in the vertical stitch right next to that. So this is on the sweater. Find the next vertical stitch, cast on a knit stitch, and then work your return pass. So yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, until you get to the end of the row. This return pass is a little bit different because we don't want to add more space between the stitching. So that's why you don't do the cast over or the yarn over, pull through 1, and then yarn over, pull through 2. You just go directly into yarn over, pull through 2. Now for the rest of the hemline, you're going to do your row 1, row 2 repeat. So for your row number 2, remember you skip the first chain space, insert your hook from the front of the fabric to the back of the fabric, and you're going to cast on into every chain space. When you get to the last chain space, as this is a row 2 repeat, you are going to have to cast on into that final space. So insert your hook in that final chain space, cast on 1. Again, count your loops to make sure you have the same number throughout, and you're going to knit stitch into the next available vertical stitch on the sweater. So we're going to knit stitch right here, pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. Repeat row 1 and row 2 until you get to that final vertical stitch of the round. And just to show you what that vertical stitch looks like, so here is that initial chain. It's going to be the vertical stitch right before that. So it might be a little bit small, so you might have to look for it a little bit, but it's right there. It's super tiny. And that's because of the tension between switching from using the 2 hooks to suddenly using just the one-sided hook. So that one is going to tend to be a little bit smaller. But once you find that one, that's going to be the final stitch of the row. Leave that one available. We are going to be crocheting a bind off. So crochet up until the second to last vertical stitch, and then we'll do the bind off. Now you no longer need to use both sides of the hook, so you can cut this additional thread. I would leave it a little bit long so you can use that to sew your hemline closed. All right, so this same method that we used for the hemline is going to be what we're going to use at the end of the sleeve for the cuff. So I won't show it to you a second time. So if you need to see this again, just come back to this part of the video. All right, but I'm going to continue working on the hemline. I'll see you again here in just a moment. So I've made it all the way around and I'm at that final vertical stitch. So the final vertical stitch, you're not going to cast it on like you did all of these other stitches, you have to work that bind off. So the bind off is going to be similar to the bind off that we did earlier, so it doesn't really matter whether you use the front of the fabric or the back of the fabric. The point is, you are going to single crochet into each of these chain spaces. So I'm going to insert my hook into that first chain space, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then I'm going to single crochet. So yarn over and pull through the 2 loops on my hook. So yarn over, pull through these 2 loops, and then I'm going to repeat this in the next chain space. So insert my hook into the chain space, yarn over and pull up a loop. Now again, it doesn't matter whether you're using the front of the fabric or the back of the fabric. You just have to single crochet. So remember to crochet into the first chain space of the row and then the last chain space of the row. And then you're going to have to knit stitch into that last vertical stitch on the sweater. So here's that vertical stitch. It's quite small. There we go. And then you single crochet here. And then I'm going to chain 1 just to make a little knot here at the bottom, and I'm going to cut my yarn. Then I'm just going to pull the hook out along with the yarn, tighten up that knot here at the bottom, and you're going to sew this closed. Use whatever stitch you want, and then you move on to the sleeve. Now on the sleeve, if you've left your stitch markers, this is going to make everything just a little bit easier. We're also going to work in the round, so you're going to cast on in one of your stitch markers. So I'm right-handed, so I'm going to use this one, and you're going to work your way all the way around to the other stitch marker and then join everything together like we did right below the arm. So when we started the body of the sweater, we're going to do something very similar to that. And for the sleeve, you are going to have to work some decreases. So you're going to work 3 rounds, just regular rounds, no decreases, and then every 4th round you're going to work a decrease. And that's going to give a little bit more shape to our sleeve, so you don't end up with one wide sleeve all the way throughout. That way it'll taper down until you get to the cuff. So let's cast on. We're going to insert our hook into the space right before that stitch marker, or that very first vertical stitch. We're going to leave a nice long tail end of yarn. You are going to need it to sew the bottom part of the sleeve, as you will see here in a few rows, it does leave a bit of an open space. So leave a nice long tail end of yarn. So make a loop on your hook, pull that through the stitch, and then you're going to begin your knit stitch. So we've got our first loop, we're going to drop our tail end, and you're going to knit stitch in the next vertical stitch. And then just continue to knit stitch until you can no longer add stitches to the row. And then you're going to begin with your extended return pass using the back side of your hook. Once you get to the last stitches of the round, you're going to continue the round. So insert your hook into this final stitch at the end of the row, and you're going to close the round. And to close the round, we're just going to work into that first vertical stitch. So I'm going to grab a stitch counter. Now if you want a stitch counter like this, the links are down in the description box. Otherwise you can jot it down on a sheet of paper, whatever you want. But you are going to need to keep track of the row counts for the sleeve. So you're going to close your round by stitching into that first vertical stitch. So right in here. You're just going to work that as a knit stitch. So from here on out, everything is knit stitch, including the decreases, which I will show you here in just a moment. So this is the beginning of round 2. I'm going to crochet 3 rounds, and I'll see you at the end of round 4. Now before I get too far into this, let me show you the space I was talking about. So when you leave that long tail end, that's to sew this space that's going to be left between the stitches. But once you're done with your sleeve, you take that extra yarn and then just sew up the space. Alright, once you've completed your 4 rounds, we're going to do the decrease. So find the spot that's right between the 2 stitch markers, so at the armpit, right at the bottommost center of the sleeve, and you're going to pick just 2 of the vertical stitches. We're going to knit these 2 stitches together, so knit 2 together, and to do this, you're going to insert your hook behind the top leg of the first stitch, just the top leg. And you're going to go directly into the next stitch, and you're going to knit stitch. So you should have both vertical stitches on your hook like this, yarn over and pull through both of those legs so that you only pull up 1 loop. And that's it. That was the decrease. Then you just go into the next stitch and knit stitch like you normally would, and continue to knit stitch all the way around. You're going to repeat this decrease every 4th round. That way your sleeve will taper down and you'll have a nice smaller sleeve towards the wrist. So again, 3 rounds, just regular knit stitch all the way around, and on the 4th round, you decrease. Make sure you keep track of the number of rounds you crocheted as well as which rounds you did your decreases on so that you can make 2 matching sleeves. Now, the cuff is crocheted exactly the same way as the hemline. So if you need to review that, just go back in the video to the hemline and crochet the cuff the exact same way. Make sure that you weave in all of your ends, stitch up the bottom part just below the armpit, and you are done. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and to see some more of my content, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at mode.bespoke. And for those of you that love patterns, my pattern book is now available on Amazon. You can also find a copy on my website, that's modebespoke.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all again in the next tutorial.